the demon chicken is my favorite character we've ever read about.
Oh my god, the demon chicken. I died. I am such a stan for the demon chicken.
Every time the demon chicken did something, I'm just like, yes.
Welcome to Your Safe Space, the podcast your partner, friends, parents, whoever thinks is dirty. Don't have time to read books? Want to understand the TikToks? We got you, fam. We're the Spice Traders, and we deal in spicy books. My name's Katie, and I need it to make sense.
Hi, I'm Des, and I would love to talk about feelings today.
I'm Liz, and I'm hypercritical. As always, we start every episode with 3 things. The first is a generic trigger warning. You can find specific triggers for this book in our show notes, so please check those out. Also, we do use foul language and talk a lot about sex. If you have sensitivity to that, this isn't the podcast for you.
Secondly, we talk about books. The whole book, nothing but the book, so help me goddess. If you plan to read this book and you don't want something spoiled, don't listen to this episode right now.
Lastly, we acknowledge that a good book can hit you at the wrong time. The views expressed in our discussion are our opinions, and we absolutely do not want to diminish the work and the talent of the authors in our community. That said, we have some notes. Hello, amazing listeners. Desiree here from the cutting room floor with a quick special update. I wanted to let you know that for the first bit of this episode, my microphone was not working properly, and it's resulted in some pretty echoey audio. It's not unbearable, but it is noticeable, so I wanted to let you know so you don't think it's anything to do with your own settings. Good news, it's not the whole episode, and it is something I've made sure is resolved in the future. For now, thanks again for bearing with us, and enjoy the episode. Alright, so Liz, what are we talking about today?
Today, we are talking about Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, whose pronouns are she, her. This was published in 2022, and it is a standalone novel. It does fall in our shorty bracket at 245 pages in a physical copy. Though it is a short book by page length, it doesn't read like a short book. However, that is absolutely not a complaint by any means, but I finished this book feeling like it was solidly 400 pages. And I'm not sure why. We kind of touched on that. We'll probably touch on it more. There's just so much depth to what's happening that it feels much longer. Now, I usually discuss the cover, and this cover really got me. It's the back view of a girl, and she is basically covered in nettles and bones. So there's vines, and there's like spines and bones hanging off of it, which leads to this eerie feeling that we get right when we jump into the book. What did you guys think off the bat?
Have you guys seen the hardcover?
No.
Oh, I really love the hardcover.
Is it?
I'm probably going to buy
Is it
the
this one with
hardcover
like the
physical.
diamond on it?
I need that in my life.
I do like that. I'm going to buy this book because I read it and I want it in real life because I want to highlight every other sentence.
Yeah, truly.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, I know. I love that cover. Yes.
I do too.
Add to basket. Okay. There's a lot to unpack in this book, even though it's short. So, without farther ado,
So pretty.
Without
further ado, Katie, take us on this whimsical journey.
All right, let's get it. So the book opens and we meet Mara, and she's making something out of metal wire and bones. She's working in a charnel pit, and if you don't know what that is, please don't look it up, but it's essentially where people dump bodies, and we're not really sure why the bodies are there. But as she's working, she ruminates about the different layers of bodies that she's encountering because she's looking for particular bones. She encounters basically first the people who ate deer and cattle, and when those ran out, the people ate horses, and when those ran out, they ate the dogs, and when the dogs ran out, they ate each other. So we come to understand that she is in a place where there are cannibals, and as she works, she sings a song to herself about a harper who made a harp out of a woman's bones and hair, and asks herself, what kind of life do you lead that you find yourself building a harp out of corpses?
I mean, these are the real questions we have.
These are the questions of our time. It's a good juxtaposition because she's wondering about that as she herself is making something out of wire and bones.
Yeah. Off the bat, like right after the first couple paragraphs, I already know I'm going to love this book because it's creepy and it's beautiful.
Absolutely.
And I'm just like, I am here for it.
I know that I'm going to love her because she thinks to herself that she had no great love of men any longer. Dogs, though, dogs were always true. And I was like, girl, truer words are never spoken.
The dog.
So her work, she seems to be trying to craft a dog out of the bones that she can find. And she's very intentional. She wants a good, sturdy, large dog. So she'll encounter essentially the equivalent of a greyhound and think to herself that the skull that she has, this nice block of a head, doesn't really go with the finer bones of some of those slimmer dogs. So she's intentionally trying to make a dog that she would prefer and like. She's putting a lot of time and care into it. The world that she's in seems very dark right off the bat. She talks about cannibals. She's working in a charnel pit. It's almost post-apocalyptic, like post-World War II, kind of, in some of the places in Europe. It seemed very, very dark.
Yeah. I was impressed with like the world building here because like I felt desolate. I felt empty. I felt dark and despair and desperation in such a like very real internalized way just from the words that I was reading and the way that these scenes were being described.
Yeah, and even as she's working and like building this dog of bones, she's talking about how her joints are all swollen and like working with the wire is like cutting into her hands. And it's just like it's really bleak, but I also really like her off the bat because she's still kind of humming and talking to herself like, okay, I'm doing this thing, I gotta do it, as she's in a lot of pain doing this disgusting task.
Yeah, and we don't really get an answer as to why for a while. And so it seems right off the bat, this is a dark place. She might be a little insane doing this.
Yeah.
But as she works, there are crows flying above her and they call a warning. So she hides herself. And the way that she hides herself is she basically lies low in the pit that she's working. And she uses this cloak that she has on that's made of nettle wool and owl cloth. And it basically breaks up her silhouette so that if people were just to glance her way, they wouldn't see a human necessarily. As she's hiding from whatever is near to her, she remembers a human couple with whom she shared a fire recently. They were labored, clearly not well, but they conversed with her, and we learn a little bit about kind of the people that are in this land right now. So there are humans who do not eat other humans, and there are cannibals. And the cannibals don't cook the meat that they eat, and that the more that they eat, the more they hate fire. So while she was with these two other non-cannibals, they didn't have to worry about a fire because it actually helped them keep the cannibals at bay. Mara wonders why the humans that she's speaking with have never left, but she remarks to herself that oftentimes people in the non-blistered lands, which is where they are, can be very cruel, more cruel than the people in the blistered lands themselves, despite the fact that they have to deal with cannibals. Which is another thing that made it seem very dark because it's a very clear us-them mentality. And even after finishing the book, we don't really get a whole lot of explanation as to why.
No, I wanted to go back throughout my notes. I am counting now. I have 4 notes that are like, what about the cannibals? Can we go back to the cannibals?
Yeah.
I want to know
I
more
have a
about
couple
the
of those as
cannibals.
well.
Yeah.
Well, because it's such a like important starting point. Like it sets you in this tone, and you think, okay, I'm in this place, and like I understand like gradual movements from a dark to a light place throughout a book, but it feels so like hitting a light switch. Like you're in this dark place, and then suddenly you're no longer in it, and it after setting such a very impactful tone in the beginning of the book to completely make a departure and not reference it from the rest of the book almost feels, I don't want to say gaslighty, but like feels jarring.
I think there was a lot of intentionality there though, because she starts off in this very dark place and then it is jarring because you're back in like some semblance of normality, but the further along you go in the book, the darker you realize that quote unquote normalcy is.
It's just more hidden under like fluff.
Right. So in the blistered lands, it's at the surface level. You don't have to look very far. You know you're in a bad place. But back in the real world, it's a lot more difficult to find.
That's fair.
Oh, I didn't even think about it that way, and like that makes it so much eerier.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. I really like T. Kingfisher because her writing is it's very clear to me, at least from this book, that her writing is a different caliber of writing than most of the things that we read on this podcast.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I want to read more, even if it doesn't necessarily fall within the parameters of like what we're looking for on this podcast. But like the writing is just so good.
I agree.
And
I super
do
agree.
think, like, a disclaimer here. I mean, we're talking about how this is such a large departure, and we mentioned when we first started talking about this that we're not really sure how this got on our list for this podcast because it is solidly not even really a romance, but it's just so good that it didn't seem like a question for any of us, like if we should record it, because it's just so good.
Yeah, like I feel like I have a responsibility to tell people about this book.
Yeah, same.
Yes. But disclaimer now, if you're here for romance, this is not the one for you.
But that's really what good writing is, right? The kind of thing that you want to evangelize and be like, you have to read this.
Yeah.
I want to buy 100 copies and give it to everyone I know.
I know, right?
Have you heard about our Lord and Savior, Nettle and Bone?
Our Lord and Savior, T. Kingfisher.
Yeah, right. Anyway, we learn that Mara is 30 years old, and as she finishes up the dog comes alive, and it kind of shakes itself. She's very pleased with her work. It tries out its paws that are all wired together, if somewhat a little bit clumsily. But as soon as it kind of gets its bearings, the dog runs off. And Mara is just devastated. She says, of course I should have bound it to me, like with a leash or something, but she didn't even think that a dog would run away from its master. You know, the thought here is that the dog had a spirit and it remembered its owners from before, and perhaps that's what it was going to go find. But we learn why she was trying to make this dog. She had gone to see someone called a dust wife, and this person had set her 3 tasks. The cloak that she wears, made of owlcloth and nettles, is the first one. The second task is to build a dog of cursed bones, and the third task is to catch moonlight in a jar of clay. If she does this, then the dust wife will give her the tools to kill a prince. We don't know why she wants to kill a prince, but this is setting up the story in a really interesting way.
Yes.
Yes. Or even what prince? Like, is it a
I
specific
know.
prince or just a prince?
Do you know this prince? Did he do
Right.
something to you?
Is it just like any prince? Like, is this for some other reason?
This is one of those books that does a great job of show don't tell, and like lets you figure out things as you're going along. And then like if you still haven't gotten it in like a few chapters, there'll be like a connection point for you, or they'll spell it out a little bit more for you, which I really
Or they'll
appreciated.
even, the characters will make it into a joke,
Right.
Yes.
which I love. So as she's wallowing in the fact that her dog just ran away, we learn a little bit more about Mara. She has 2 sisters, Damia, who is 6 years older and a half-sister, and Kanya, who is 2 years older and a full-blooded sister. Mara and her sisters were princesses, and her parents are the king and queen of a small kingdom that ruled over a deep water harbor between 2 much larger kingdoms. And Mara talks about how her mother was very adept at balancing those 2 kingdoms and keeping their own little fiefdom safe and alive. But then the Prince of the North decided that he would take a wife, and he would take one of her sisters as his wife. That would cement an alliance, and it would ostensibly make that balancing act between the northern and the southern kingdoms a lot easier. Unfortunately, Damia doesn't live much longer than her actual marriage, only 5 months. And when her body comes home in state, Mara is so young that she doesn't really believe it's happened. And she remarks seeing kind of this procession of black horses and carriages, etc. It struck her watching as an extravagance of grief. Someone wanted the world to know how sad he could afford to be.
I love the term extravagance of grief. I have
Yes.
seen that. I
Yes.
have witnessed it. And it is such a... God, the writing in this book is so good.
It's so good. I at some point I had to stop putting quotes because that was the only thing that I was putting in my notes.
I know.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to end up reading the book on the podcast, and like maybe that's not the ideal situation.
It's not
but
quite what we're
truly,
here
y'all,
for, but
the writing in this book is just gorgeous.
stunning.
And I did keep some quotes in there, so it's not, you will get a flavor of it.
I have in the quotes doc that we have, I have 6 or 7 so far.
Nice.
Excellent.
So back in the Blistered Lands, Mara nears the edge of this area and remarks how clear the boundary is, right? So it's very clearly happy, healthy, green, regular trees, and the Blistered Land is very not okay. Scarred land, charred, twisted, not green things. And she finds it creepy that it took her relatively little time to get there. She decided that she was going to do this task from the Dustwife, and as soon as she set her mind to it, she found the Blistered Lands, almost as if the land was enchanted to find someone if you decided to want to find it. And I love the idea that no matter where you are, the Blistered Land will find you if you want to. Very creepy and very interesting.
So creepy. I loved that.
I want to know more about why the Blistered Land can do that.
I know, and we don't find out. But that's one of those things that, like, I want to know more, but it doesn't bother me that we don't find out, because it's just, like, atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just part of the world. As she leaves the Blistered Lands, it feels like there's a curse that makes her arms itch, but, like, that never came back up, so I think it's just a product of her leaving the Blistered Lands.
Yeah.
I think so, too.
One thing to note is the time is a little weird in this book in the beginning, because we're going back and forth a lot between, like, the past and her current, and it's not super well delineated necessarily in terms of, like, now we're back to the past, or here we are in the future. So I did struggle with that a little bit, where I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, and at some point we just stay in the past for a while until we catch up to the future.
Yeah.
Which was a little bit off-putting, but it typically happened in between chapters, or there was, like, very noticeable breaks. So that did help.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we do switch back to the past. And after Mara's sister's death, the prince offered to marry Kanya, her middle sister. Their mother, yeah, so kind. So how benevolent. Their mother, the queen, put the prince off for a year out of respect for Damia, but ultimately accepted the offer to cement the alliance. Because Kanya does not give the prince children, the prince ultimately decides that he wants Mara to go into a convent so she doesn't get pregnant and then somehow challenge the throne. So she goes to a convent dedicated to Our Lady of Grackles.
2 things. One, I thought it was the mother that sent her there, not so much the prince. Like, the prince didn't actually say, like, hey, you should send her to a convent. The mother was like, I'm going to send you to a convent so you can kind of be out of the way for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, the prince didn't show up and, like, drag her there, but I got the impression that it was his insecurity that made her go to the convent.
Got it.
Yeah, to, like, keep her on reserve.
The other thing that
Right.
I loved is the Lady of Grackles. Like, I just love...
Yeah.
Grackles are just such a... Like, I have a couple friends whose favorite birds are grackles, and I always think that's really funny.
Really?
Yeah.
Weird.
I don't even think I know what a grackle looks like.
It's a
I'm gonna look it
blackbird,
up.
right?
I figured it was black.
Yeah.
I want
a
to say it's in, like,
crowy
the crow
type
or the
bird?
raven family, yeah.
Grackle.
Yeah, but I love that there's a whole house devoted to this bird.
I
Oh,
know,
they're,
me
like-
too.
They're, like, rainbowy.
Yeah, they are like
Oh.
rainbow. Like, oil slick is what some people will call them.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
A Lady of Grackles. I mean, I'm down to sign up for that religion. Sign me up.
Yeah.
She sounds great.
So Mara goes to the convent, and she finds it unfair that her sister's fertility or lack thereof basically keeps them all hostage, puts her where she doesn't want to be. But
If only
she
she
eventually,
knew.
yeah, but eventually she does like it there because she can work with her hands. And when she closes the door to her room, the door stays closed. She ruminates that princesses are public property, and she didn't realize before that a mere peasant had more power than a princess, that she could close the door, which I thought was very interesting. She talks about how servants keep going in and out all the time.
That's one of my quotes.
That was really powerful,
Yep.
yes.
It's good.
It's so,
So-
good.
At the convent, she actually gets into working with her hands, as I said, and at first she doesn't do physical labor like shoveling shit out of a stable, but she learns that this is because basically the sisters know that she's of noble birth. And from then on, she insists on being treated no differently. She goes by herself to the stables and starts shoveling shit, which I thought was very admirable.
I love that so much, especially when she's taught how to shovel shit, because she
Right.
doesn't do it right.
Yeah, she's like doing it wrong. And the abbess comes up and is like, you know, you don't have to do that. And she's like, I know I don't have to do that, but I am doing it. And the abbess is like, fair enough, you're holding it wrong.
I loved
I
that.
did too.
Yeah. Back in the present, Mara is leaving the Blistered Lands, and she is accosted by a man who tells her to go back in or he will kill her. He has a shovel and he starts advancing on her, but before he can actually harm her in any way, the dog that she made out of bones comes running out of the fog back to his creator and saves her. The man is so freaked out that he turns tail and runs away.
I was going to say that throughout this book, we get, this dog is a ongoing character, Bone Dog. And I can picture this dog. I pictured the dog from Corpse Bride, but like bigger.
Yes. Uh-huh.
But then there's moments like this where to me, Bone Dog is really cute and lovely. But the moments like this, I'm like, that must be terrifying to see this like bone wire beast like
Yes.
come out at you, because he's also big.
Yeah.
He's not a weenie dog like in Corpse Bride.
No, I pictured him being like Irish wolfhound size.
Yeah,
man.
like he's massive. And can you imagine that just like coming out of the darkness at you?
Yeah, like a Rottweiler and an Irish wolfhound had a love child.
I pictured
Yes.
him more like Yogi. Like I pictured Yogi
Aw.
because like a lot of the things Bone Dog did reminded me of Yogi, and she talked about kind of having that more block head, and so I was
Yeah.
kind of thinking about Yogi and his big head because he always has such a lovable big head. So for reference, Yogi
Yeah.
is Katie's dog.
Yeah. Especially when my dog and Bone Dog do the same thing where they'll sit on your foot.
Oh,
And-
I love that.
With my dog, it's really cute because he's a flesh and like
He's a flesh
fur.
creature.
Yeah, but with the Bone Dog, it's really not funny because he'll sit on people's feet and it's just bones and wires and shit, and it's real painful.
And the wires like dig into you.
Butters
Yeah.
does that, which is my dog, but she is also flesh, but it hurts. It's mostly just bony butt into my foot, and it hurts.
I love now that we have to clarify. My dog is flesh.
My dog is flesh. My flesh dog.
My flesh
I-
creature.
My fur baby, I am his skin mother. Anyway. So this is really the last time that we see the Blistered Lands, and we almost exclusively stay in the past and learn what has happened to Mara to get her to the Blistered Lands. So, back in the past, we learned that while at the convent, Mara has a brief affair with one of the acolytes at the monastery next door. So she's, loses her V card, has a nice little flirtatious fling with him, but then she overhears him boasting about how he bedded one of the king's bastards. And this really breaks her heart, and she mourns the loss of that relationship. One of the sisters, Sister Apothecary, visits her and is basically like, all right, kid, what's up? Spill the beans. And drinks with her while the sister tells her of her first love, and that makes Mara feel better. She eventually unburdens herself to the sister, and the sister has the acolyte sent away.
I loved that.
I feel like so much of the commentary of this book is just going to be us saying things and going, I love that.
I
love
know.
that. I know. It really is.
She mentions that that's really the only time that she had like a serious relationship with anybody, because she's not actually a nun. She didn't take orders. She's just staying at the convent. So it's not like she's breaking the rules to do these things. But the only other thing that she mentions is that she had this crush on like a traveling professor that came through. And I feel like Mara would really appreciate some of the books that we read.
I agree.
She would. I loved her because she doesn't take orders, and that continues to be the thing she talks about. She's like, well, I'm not really a nun.
Yeah. I'm
Throughout
kind
the
of a
book.
nun and I'm kind of a princess, but I'm not really good at either.
Right, like, I don't really want to be either completely.
Right. So when Mara's 25, her sister finally gives birth, and she and her mother are summoned for the event. They arrive when Kanya is in labor, and when Kanya and Mara get a moment alone, Kanya basically clings on to Mara and tells her that if Kanya dies, do not let their mother marry Mara off to the prince, that Mara should run far, far away and ruin herself before she lets that happen. Mara is a little bit, I'll say, slow on the uptake. She's not like mentally slow. She just isn't worldly. So she doesn't really understand what Kanya is trying to tell her in the moment. And she tries to rationalize it by saying, you know, it must have been the pain that she was going through or something like that that made her say something like that. Kanya gives birth to a daughter, which is clearly a disappointment because it's not a son.
Which Mara also remarks, like, she doesn't really understand why people don't seem happy about it.
Yes, exactly.
And I think it's important to say, like, the reason we say, like, she is not slow mentally is because that is one thing that, like, she is being told in her youth is that she is. And I don't think that's the case. Like, yeah, she's a little slow in the uptake, but I just think it's not that. It's that she's just a little slow in the uptake. She's just not putting those pieces together as quickly as other people. But a lot of her family, when she's younger, spends a lot of time telling her that she's not that smart. And kind of belittling her for that. And I think that that's really unfortunate because it's very clear that she is a very intelligent woman.
And very capable. I mean, the kind of adage, if you keep trying to judge a fish by how well it can climb trees, like it's gonna fail every time, or something like that. Yeah, that's what comes to mind when I think about Mara.
Yeah.
The other thing that I find really interesting, that continues throughout the book, is after Damia dies and we see Kanya and Mara's relationship, it's very clear that it's not really clear how Kanya feels, but Mara believes that Kanya hates her and that like there's no love lost. But as we move into the story, that is such an interesting thing to keep in the back of my head as like the whole plot and their relationship. Like she goes to such lengths for someone that she thinks hates her.
Yeah.
I think what, especially in that context, is that Mara takes the things that people say at face value. And the reason that she thinks Kanya hates her is because when Kanya was a child, she would say, "I hate you," to Mara.
Yes.
But like, kids say shitty things all the time. It doesn't mean that's how they really feel.
Right. And like, they're in their 30s now.
Right. And she was like 10.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, Mara stays through the christening. And during that time, she and her maid gossiped. The maid tells her that all of the prior royalty for the Northern Kingdom is buried in separate rooms underneath the palace, kind of in this ever-expanding maze. So a king will die, they will get buried in their own room, and their wife will get buried next to them, their children next to them, etc., and onward, all the way back through the lines of this family. But because basically their tombs are below the palace, there's this rumor that prior kings haunt current ones, which is why the people say that the current royal family of the North have such short lives. They talk specifically about the current king, who's in his 50s, but Mara remarks that he looks like he's easily 80-something. He's just had a really hard time of it.
She says, like, that can't possibly be right. And then she kind of does the math, and she's like, yeah, I guess that must be right.
Yeah, but he looks like an old man. During the christening, Mara sees the prince for the first time, and it's kind of like the don't meet your heroes kind of thing, because she's shocked at how short he is.
That's all she can say. He's short.
She's built him up to be this villain in her head, or not necessarily a villain at this point, but this powerful, all-seeing person, right? He had married her first sister. She died. Now he has her second sister. He's essentially the reason she's at the convent. And so when she finally meets him, it's a little bit of a letdown. She's like, oh, that's it?
You're awfully small.
During the christening ceremony, the godmother comes in. And so godmothers apparently exist here, and they actually bless babies, which I love.
Yes.
And the godmother blesses her essentially with protection.
All right. This is my gift, said the godmother. Her voice was not loud, but it was so silent that it carried to the far corners of the room. I have served her as I have served her line, my life bound to theirs. No foreign magic shall harm them. No enemy shall topple their throne, as it has been for all of the children of the royal house.
So shall it be for her for as long as I draw breath.
So this woman has been blessing all of the kings in this line since they took the throne, or since at least for several generations, which makes her quite old, unnaturally so.
The godmother is also kind of terrifying.
Yeah. So the godmother's described as an ancient individual. She has skin that has become so... She's so old that her skin has ceased to have wrinkles, and it's just stretched really thinly over her skull now.
Which no one really seems to question either, which I feel like maybe they should.
Yeah, no one seems to question that, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
So Mara goes back to the convent and settles back into her routine. Within 6 months, she hears that her sister is pregnant again. She thinks that this is a little bit alarming because she just so recently gave birth, but she kind of lets it drop before, without asking any more questions. But she realizes that she's never summoned for the birth, even after 11 months. She presumes Kanya must have lost the baby, if one existed at all. And so her daily life just keeps going. She begins helping Sister Apothecary with her chores, as well as more medical tasks like setting broken bones or helping with births. And after attending a lot of these births, Mara exclaims to Sister Apothecary how awful this whole thing is and that she just won't do it. She refuses. Sister Apothecary tells her that there are ways that you can decrease the likelihood of birth, but you can't. It's not a foolproof method, right? It's like that 99.9%.
Yes. And that some ways are dangerous.
Yeah. But Mara studies these just in case that she's ever called into service as the prince's next blood mare. So she knows what's up.
She does know what's up.
Yeah.
I also really liked this this like empowering like birth control, abortion, like I can teach you ways to do this. And she was like, yep, I'm going to learn those things.
Right.
Thank you.
She also remarks that she wishes that she could share this information with her sister so that she wouldn't have to keep getting pregnant over and over and over again like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which we'll get to why.
A few months on, a fever sweeps through the city. Mara recovers, but her niece sadly does not. So Kanya's baby daughter, who she attended the christening for, has died.
So at first I really struggled with this because I was like, they are worlds apart, right? Like it took her like a day or two to get to christening the first time. So like they're very far apart. But then I remembered how quickly COVID spread and I was like, oh, never mind.
Yeah. Or like the Black Plague, like that was
like Black
all of
Plague.
Europe.
Yeah.
Like immediately.
Yeah. So even though they're not in the same town or the city or whatever, like everybody gets this and it wipes out a lot of the population. Even one of the sisters, the abbess, I believe, gets it really badly and she never is recovered back to full health.
Right.
But Mara is summoned to her niece's funeral, and when she sees her sister, she realizes that Kanya is pregnant again. And she's a little bit concerned, but doesn't really think much of it at first. Then, at a family, quote-unquote, family dinner, things are awkward and
Say the least.
silent. And when it's finished, it gets worse because Mara gets an insight into how the prince treats Kanya. He basically gets up and tells Kanya to look decent tomorrow because she looks a mess now. And when she essentially says, yes, you're absolutely right, she asks for the ability to participate in a vigil for her daughter. And even Mara can tell that the prince is about to say no, except for the old king, who is basically a demented old man at this point, even though he's 50, interjects vaguely and says something to the effect of, oh yeah, that's the right thing to do. What a good idea. And so the prince basically has to let his wife do this, but it's dark in
Well,
here.
then they have to fight about like whether or not she's going to have guards on her while she is holding vigil, and she's trying to say no, and he's like, no, you need them, and it's very tense in this space.
Very tense.
When Mara meets her sister for the vigil, she's escorted to the church where her sister waits for her. And there's this quote about Kanya. Quote, Kanya just stood inside the door, her face blank, as if she had stepped away from her own face a little while and retreated somewhere deep inside. And this is just a really good example of how whimsical the writing is, and I just love it so much.
Yeah, it's such beautiful writing, and the feelings that are evoked when you're reading, like being a feelings-based person, was so powerful, and I felt swayed like when I was reading this in a way that I don't frequently feel swayed.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the thing about the whimsy that at least T. Kingfisher does so well, where even when it is these like strange turns of phrase, they are very whimsical. They like hit such human emotion that like it's not a way that I haven't like read it explained that way before, but it just hits so true to be like, yes, like I can feel that feeling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So when Mara speaks with her sister Kanya during the vigil, it's very clear that the prince is an abusive, jealous bastard.
Yep.
So much so that when he was away for some king or princely duty, he wouldn't touch his wife for 9 months just to make sure that she hadn't stepped out and gotten pregnant by somebody. But he's still convinced that the moment that she's out of his sight that she will bed somebody else. Hence the conversation about the guards. Hence the conversation about not wanting to let her have a vigil for her daughter. To make it worse, he physically abuses her. Mara sees a bruise on Kanya's wrist that's kind of covered up by her sleeves. And Kanya also shares that even when she has sex with her husband, the prince makes his guards watch.
Which, why?
It's a control and demeaning thing.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you guys
Oh man, you're turning into me. Who are you?
I
Yeah.
am. We've switched sides. What do you think about Kanya? Like in this conversation?
I'm gonna need you to be more specific.
Yeah.
So throughout this conversation, like when Mara sees the bruises and is like talking about this, Kanya is very, I don't know if I like it or I hate it, because she's very like, well, obviously, like, what did you think was happening? Like, she kind of reiterates that, like, Mara, you're so stupid. Like, of course he's hitting me. Of course he's hurting me. And
I don't know. I think that Kanya's a very like, I don't know. Kanya kind of reminds me of me in a little bit, a lot of ways, because she just expects everybody to be in her own understanding, right? And when they're not, she's frustrated.
Yes.
She doesn't hide it as well as I do, right?
No.
So,
well, and in that vein, I can respect where she's coming from, because she's like, I've been in that place where like I am in a bad place and I have come to terms with it, and I don't want to have to hold your hand through the understanding of what I'm going through.
Yeah. I think that's where she's at. Because she's been being abused and basically impregnated as soon as fucking possible for years at this point. And so I feel like she's fully aware of the situation that she's in. Like, this dude is a monster. He killed my sister. He's gonna kill me as soon as I have a son. Mara, I'm not going to explain anything to you. Thanks for being here. But, like, I'm just trying to survive.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's in this conversation where she even says, like, though she knows she's going to be killed as soon as she has a boy, it's better for her to stay pregnant, because then at least he doesn't hit her as, like, he's not as physically abusive, because he's not going to risk a miscarriage after, like, the first couple that he seems to have caused.
Yep.
So it's, like, a reprieve when she's pregnant, kind of.
Which,
And
Man, it's dark.
so dark.
And this is when Kanya kind of explains what she said when she warned Mara to ruin herself, because she basically says, like, if I don't give him a son, he's going to move on to you.
Mm-hmm.
He's already done it to 2 sisters. What's a third?
Which that comes back into the whole Mara thinking Kanya hates her, because that in of itself, I feel like, is such an act of love for her sister that Mara doesn't see as clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, Kanya is really taking it where, like, I mean, she could kill herself and escape.
Right, exactly.
She doesn't.
Yeah, oof. So when Mara and her mother arrive back at their home city, Mara stays one night in the palace in her old room, and she tries to speak to her mother about what's going on with Kanya, and it's clear that her mother knows, but is in a tough position. She admits that she knew about it before going into the marriage with Damia, but she hoped that the prince would not be so stupid as to she uses a term basically that like he wouldn't take out his particular proclivities on his wife, but unfortunately that's not the case. And she tells Mara not to speak to anybody about it because the prince has eyes and ears everywhere, and they're in a very bad, precarious position right now. In this interaction, Mara seems pretty simple when it comes to politics, but I think it's because she's just so naive, right? She's not good at statescraft. She's almost childlike when it comes to the motivations of others. And this is what I have in my notes. Like, I really hope there's not smut in this because, like, I'm not even sure I would be okay with, like, that here.
Because she's just so innocent.
She
Right.
grows so much in this book that by the end of it,
She super
I
does.
get a little frustrated because I would love some spice.
Well,
I
and when we
know.
meet the male lead, I'm like, okay, you guys are like,
Really cute.
yeah.
And my
But
note here is, like, unless she goes on a major maturity arc, which she does.
which she does. She's a huge growth arc. And I feel bad for her because this kind of, again, like her mom sort of, or in this conversation reiterates that like, you don't know enough, but she's also the second spare. So I can't imagine she was really taught any of this.
Right.
Yeah.
She even says that about the work that she gets to do at the convent. Like, she's interested, which is not something that she had ever experienced before. So she's interested in learning how to embroider and weave and knit and all of these things. But that was never something that she was encouraged to do in any subject when she was growing up. Like, she was taught how to read and write and all of that stuff, but she was never taught to have an interest in anything. And I think that's where a lot of her quote unquote simpleness comes from, or perceived simpleness, I'll say.
Right.
All right. So this is ultimately what causes Mara to go on her journey. She worries so much for her sister, and she feels compelled to do something, but for a while she feels powerless to actually affect any kind of change. She spends a couple of weeks basically losing sleep and fretting over it at the convent, to the point that Sister Apothecary is like, girl, are you pregnant or in love? Like,
That's the only things that look like this.
the only
Which
things with
I-
symptoms that look like this.
I love Sister Apothecary. I mean,
I
like,
do.
we get good replacements for her, but I was also down for her to be like that in the whole book.
I
She's
know,
great.
same. Then one day, Mara hears two women outside of the convent talking about a dust wife who can do magic. We learned that dust wives are essentially like cemetery keepers. They can speak to the dead, and so they act kind of as someone who looks after them with the living and helps them along their journey. And so that ability comes with a certain amount of inherent magic.
The aspect we get of the dust wives, of like what their role is, I thought was so creepy, but also like really sweet, where they are the ones who like dig the graves, because otherwise the spirits might think that someone is grave robbing and attack. So even when the dust wives get too old to do that, they will come out with a shovel and like turn the first bit of earth.
Yep.
And I just loved that.
I do too. I love, and that's the kind of, I'm not even going to call it whimsy. It's just different, right? A different type of world building, a different type of magic. And like even the concept of godmothers, and we'll get into a little bit more, like godmothers are not necessarily good, right?
No.
And I have never read a book, fairy tale or like new adult fantasy or anything in between, that has this unique of a world. And I just loved every bit of it.
Yeah, agreed.
And it's so detailed. Like,
Yeah.
I think the point that you're saying about the magic, like that's something I recognize as well, is like the magic is so unique and well done. Like it feels
Yeah.
really balanced. Like we've talked in other books about how like, you know, there's magic that doesn't seem to have any limits, but like, or arbitrary limits. All of this magic seems, without being beaten over the head with it, really well balanced. Like it's never like, oh, you have to like give away this thing to be able to do it, or like it runs out at the drop of a hat, or it doesn't run out and you're like, why not? This
Right.
all feels really well balanced and really well set up.
I agree wholeheartedly. So after hearing about these dust wives, she goes and sees the local dust wife in her city. And when she meets this woman, she basically tells her about the situation without revealing that she's a princess. And the woman tells her that she can't help her, that she must seek a more powerful dust wife with deeper magic. And she directs Mara to a woman who is in the Southern Kingdom, far away, that might be able to help her. But interestingly, the dust wife says, if you succeed, come back and tell me how it went. And Mara says, well, I might not make it out alive. And she says, I'll still be able to hear you.
Which is also really cool. It's sad, but very cool.
Very cool, very sad. So she goes back to the convent and says her goodbyes to Sister Apothecary. And Sister Apothecary basically says, it gives her some money and gives her some advice on how to get around, sets her up with a shepherd who takes her south of the city, where she can begin to hire coaches to get to a place called an Esempque. SMQ.
The names of these places I did really struggle with. I'll say that.
Yeah. Anyway, so she's going to SMQ.
Sure.
It's somewhere in the Southern Kingdom. On her journey, she's moving from hired coach to hired coach, and what she ends up doing is actually very interesting. She ends up sleeping in the coaches so she doesn't have to pay for an inn, which I thought was interesting because she only has the finite amount of money that Sister Apothecary gave her for her journey, and she doesn't want to run out of it. She doesn't know how long her journey is going to be, but she wants to set herself up for success. And largely, her journey goes fine. She's not immediately comfortable with how to hire a coach, which I resonated with, because she's like, I don't know what the protocol is here, but she watches a couple of other people do it, and then she eventually gets comfortable with it, which is literally how I operate.
Yeah.
But on one of these coaches, she basically gets accosted by a man who starts giving her a hard time. He's asking her questions that she doesn't want to answer, and she doesn't have to answer. And when she doesn't answer, he gets angry and starts cursing at her. And then a woman sitting next to Mara basically tells the man, hey, can you not? She's a nun. Like, what do you think you're doing? And the man immediately is chastised and stops doing what he's doing and gets off at the next stop. And this woman says to tell people that Mara is a nun straight away. She says, quote, there's many a man who will not think twice to mistreat a woman, but who lives in fear of a habit and a holy symbol.
That was such a powerful quote.
It was.
Because holy shit, is it true?
Yep.
It is very true.
Yeah, like somehow when you belong to Jesus or a god or something, you're
allowed to have more body autonomy or whatever.
Right, exactly. She finally makes her way to the powerful dust wife. And when she does, she walks over a bunch of loose stones. And the quote is, they rattled and slid underfoot, talking to each other in stone language, saying all the words they'd been saving up until the next time a human walked across them.
So
Stunning.
Good.
So good. She says about the house that it would have been alarming had the chickens not been out in front of it, being so relentlessly chicken-like. It's hard to be frightened of the unknown when the unknown kept chickens.
Which I also really feel, because I used to have chickens. My mom has chickens. If you've ever spent time near chickens, they are just ridiculous creatures. Like,
They
it is
really
really
are.
hard to be threatened of a place that has chickens outside.
It truly is. And if you keep chickens alive, that means that you care for the sanctity of life in some way, shape, or form. And
Right.
so how
And
hard
they're
could
not
it be?
like fleeing. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't be that evil. So she meets this woman, and the woman's like, all right, sure, I can help you if you can do these 3 tasks. And so the first task is the making of the owlcloth and nettle cloak. And the way that she has to do this is go up on the roof of this woman's house and work with these scraps of owlcloth and unspun nettle wool, which she has to spin herself. But it stings her like nettles, to the point where she essentially maims her left hand working with this material to spin it into some kind of crude thread that she can stitch a cloak together with the owl cloth. She has 2 days to do this, and she does it. But like I said, it's painful. Really, really painful. But she does the cloak. The woman seems not super pleased, and then sends her off to her second task, which is to make the bone dog. When she returns with Bone Dog, The dust wife is still not pleased and also astonished. She's like, huh, you did it. Well, fuck.
There's such two impossible tasks, and you did them both.
Yeah, and she's like, are you sure I can't change your mind about wanting to kill a prince? And Mara's like, nope, I want to do this. So the dust wife picks up an earthenware jar off of the shelf, hands it to Mara. Mara takes it. The dust wife tells Mara to open it, and she does, and moonlight bathes Mara's face, and she closes it, and then the dust wife asks for the jar back, and so Mara hands it back. And the dust wife says, congratulations, you did the third task. Now we gotta go. Which I love, and she basically says that the point of setting somebody an impossible task is so that they won't do it. But Mara's already done 2, and that jarring moonlight would probably break or kill Mara, and so this was much easier.
Right, because you're clearly going to try.
Exactly.
As you've come this far.
Yeah. She goes on to say that she doesn't have a magic sword or anything to give her, so the dust wife is effectively the weapon that she gets against the prince.
Which is funny and, God, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Just
That's
like, well,
so
I guess
clever.
let's go.
Yeah, because up until here, I mean, I think most readers, but at least I was functioning that, like, she was going to get a potion or a spell or something.
Yeah, or some kind of curse, but
Yeah,
no.
the dust wife's just like, you get me, so...
Let's go. We
Well,
gotta
let's
go back to
go.
the Northern
This
Kingdom.
is where I have another one of those great lines that said, I could easily imagine someone making a saint out of her 100 years hence. Maybe some of the saints were like that too. Cranky old women with strange gifts.
Yep, that's her. So they leave in the next 3 days, and when they do, the dust wife has like put all of these preparations in order. She's grabbed a bunch of supplies. She's described as wearing this cloak that's made out of jars that have like stuff in them that clinks when she walks, which I thought was very cool. So they both have really interesting cloaks. But she specifically takes the brown chicken, and she says that the chicken has a demon in her, so it would be rude to leave her with the neighbors to deal with. So the demon chicken and the dust wife are always together, and the demon chicken sits on top of the dust wife's staff, unless she's going to lay an egg, in which case she climbs up the dust wife's arm, around her shoulders, into her pack to lay the egg, and then comes back to sit on the top of the staff.
And I just picture this, like, fat-ass chicken, like, swaying on a staff.
Yep. And she's constantly making her opinion known by, like, clucking or making sounds. Yep. And have it look being described as having disapproving looks, especially to other chickens.
I want to read a whole story about the demon and the chicken.
I know. And Mara asks, how did you get a demon and a chicken? And the dust wife says, oh, the usual way.
But then she goes on where it was something like, well, something about like, well, you couldn't put it in a rooster because that's how you get a basilisk.
Right. And I'm like, excuse me?
I know. Like, what? Oh, the usual way.
Right, the usual way. So at this point, the dust wife is like, you got to name the dog. And so they named the dog Bone Dog. Very imaginative. And actually the dust wife says, so imagination isn't your strong suit, is it?
But she says that it's important because for what they're doing, she should have like 2 feet on the ground. So her
Yes.
not being imaginative is not an insult.
Right.
But pretty backhanded nonetheless.
It is. So the 4 of them start walking, and they have to stay away from people because Bone Dog is made of bones.
He
So
is
they
a
can't
bone
like
dog.
let people see them or, get too close, or they'll start asking awkward questions. And it takes them forever. So at some point the dust wife is like, this isn't going to work. We got to go to the goblin market. And Mara's like, make fucking what? So to get to the goblin market, it's kind of a roundabout way. But to start, the dust wife leads them to a stream. And then when they get to a fork in the stream, she ends up calling a drowned boy to give them directions.
Which was kind of terrifying.
And this is a horrifying experience. Does anybody want to describe the drowned boy?
I'm trying to see if I have it like highlighted. I don't think that I do. But basically, like, it's like if a body had been sitting in water for a really long time. Like, it's bloated, bluish gray skin, which is about as far into that description as I really want to go, because it's...
Yeah. I mean, the Yeah, it's a drowned person, so they look like a drowned body,
Right.
which is terrifying. This guy is also described as being a little leering towards specifically Mara. So he's giving her the heebie-jeebies and also keeps like making faces at her. And the Dustwife tells Mara that the drowned ones tend to go bad more often than not, but at least this one did give them good directions, despite the fact that he wanted to charge more for those directions than he should have. And what he wanted to charge was he wanted the Dustwife to give him Mara. To do what with, I don't know, and I don't want to know.
No, thank you.
So he gives them the directions, and they follow them further upstream to a tree that's growing over the stream. And the Dustwife points out that it is earth, water, and air all in the same place. And this is how they're going to get into basically the other side of the veil to go into the Goblin Market. So the Dustwife hangs a pendant from the tree so that it touches the water, basically connecting these three elements. And then they duck through in the basically the window that this string makes. And as they go through this portal, Mara's ears pop and they backtrack a little bit and they come upon a staircase that goes into the ground that decidedly was not there the first time that they passed that area. As they descend, they eventually come to the balcony of a sunken room where a dazzling market is taking place. There are multicolored tents, there's all kinds of people and creatures walking around. And it's just a magical place to be, and unlike anything Mara has ever seen in her entire life, for obvious reasons.
Because she hasn't seen much.
Well,
Right.
the other thing that's interesting is the Dustwife tells her, don't stare, but don't look away if someone looks at you. Show as little weakness as you can. Agree to nothing and accept nothing until you know the price. Like, It's definitely a very magical, really cool place, but it has a lot of danger in it as well.
Yeah, very traditionally fey sounding.
Yes.
Well, and the Goblin Market is my favorite poem, like, of all time. And this does a really great, like, the imagery I have of Goblin Market with, like, this, I was like, okay, I am here for this. It is great.
Interesting. So the first thing that they buy is a moth. They go to a booth where there are a number of different moths laid out, and they buy one that shows you what you need. And the cost for this moth is 2 weeks of Mara's life. Moth acquired. They follow the moth into the moth takes flight, and they follow it through the market, through different areas, trying not to lose sight of it. They almost lose it because there's this disturbance in one of the alleys that they're in, and it's because this woman is basically taking up space and people are parting the way for her. And somebody mutters under their breath, saint, like it's a dirty word. And this woman is very interesting looking. She's very ethereal. She looks like she's floating, and she has her left hand is severed at the wrist, and she's holding it in her right hand. And so she's just got this stump and then this left hand, and she doesn't say anything, but she makes eye contact with Mara and smiles at her. Eventually, the moment passes, and they continue to find the white moth, and it eventually leads them to a booth of teeth. Mara says, of course it would be teeth, while her skin tried to crawl off her body and run away screaming. It was never not going to be horrible. Teeth, yes.
I felt that so much as someone who has recurring nightmares about teeth.
Oh yeah, you have those weird dreams.
I have weird tooth dreams.
I actually have that in my notes when we get to the tooth dancer, if that was deeply triggering for you.
It was so
like
triggering. It is burned in my head. I'm happy to talk about that scene when we get there. And by happy, I mean scarred for life.
Yeah. So the moth doesn't actually land on any tooth in particular. It lands on a man who's moving boxes in the back. And they negotiate to buy him from the stall owner for one of Mara's teeth, basically the teeth of a nun. And this guy is like, yep, seal the deal. And he summons a tooth dancer, which is a horrifying looking stork thing with a human face underneath its bill. It's just, oh my God, terrifying.
It's so scary.
But it's just got a stork head. It's got the body of a man and like man hands.
And like the lower jaw of a man, and just is like you can see a man's mouth below the beak, but it's not a mask.
Yes.
Question mark?
And so this tooth dancer comes out and he starts playing a penny whistle that makes all of Mara's teeth literally dance in her skull. And Liz is freaking out.
One of the things they say is like one of the teeth had been bothering her, and so they were going to take that tooth out. And while she said it didn't hurt, I can't imagine it not hurting.
So she asks the tooth dancer, like, is it going to hurt? And he says no. And then after this horrifying ordeal, she even says, like, it didn't hurt, but I wish it had.
I would have preferred it.
I would have preferred there to be pain.
Yeah. How much did your skin crawl?
Oh, I was so triggered by this whole scene. And I think the next time I have my tooth dream, it is going to take the place of this. And I'm going to wish for my old teeth dreams to come back. So
this book will have a lasting effect on you.
It will. So his penny whistle makes all of her teeth dance in her mouth. She can feel all of her teeth moving and jiving.
Yeah.
And he starts, and she talks about, like, the tooth that was bothering her, like, aggressively hammering, like, against her cheek. And he starts playing, like, more vigorously, and her teeth, like, move more vigorously until there's, like, a little pop. And the one bothering her just, like, flies out of her mouth, and she wants to, like, spit it out and have the whole thing end. And the creepy tooth dancer guy, we also didn't talk about his needle beak. She, like, puts in her mouth and, like, taps around in there first.
So, Liz, you were talking about how he pokes his little tooth thing and it flies out of her mouth.
Yeah.
Or flies out of her jaw.
Flies out of her jaw onto her tongue. And he, like, bloops, pulls it out of her mouth.
And hands it to the tooth selling guy.
And just, like, fucks off back to the back room, I guess.
Yeah. And then they now bought a human. And
Sure.
well, okay, I have so many thoughts.
Fine.
The man that they bought is described as being a killer who was caught sleeping in a fairy fort, which is how he ended up here. He's tall and broad-shouldered with brown eyes. The last thing that they buy in the Goblin Market is a glamour for Bone Dog, which turns him into a big gray hound. They pay for that with the egg, one of the eggs from the demon chicken, which I thought was really funny.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
Because I think they want the demon chicken, and she's like, no, I'll give you an egg. He's like, sold.
Yeah. So as they leave the same way they came back. And the entire time, the man that they bought is basically clinging to Mara, and she's clinging to him because they're both just, like, so overwhelmed. And as they get to the top of the stairs, there's a shadow there that's, like, lurking for them, but the demon chicken crows and scares it off and then looks very pleased with itself.
I fucking love the demon chicken. Like,
I want to know what that shadow was, though. I'm very curious.
I know. I want to know what it is, too.
I know.
They make their way back to the tree to basically pass back to the mortal side of the veil. And when they get to the tree, the drowned boy is waiting for them, but the Dustwife sends him on his way really fucking quick. On the other side, the man that they bought asks if he is finally free, and the Dustwife confirms, yes, you are free. We learn this man's name is Fenris, and that he comes from a land called Hardak, and that he killed a clan lord because the man was a bad man. He slept in a fairy fort deliberately to end his life because he didn't want to start a war. Basically, he was from some kind of overseeing governmental body. He killed this man, and it would have required an act of retribution, essentially, that would have caused a lot of people to lose their lives. And so he was trying to end his nobly, since suicide is frowned upon in his culture. And he thought that sleeping in a fairy fort would be the way to do that. Instead, he ended up in a market and estimates that he's been there several months. He and the Dustwife kind of get into this argument about, like, he doesn't believe in fairies despite the fact that he was in the Goblin Market and slept in a fairy fort.
Surrounded by fairies.
Yeah. And she ends the conversation by saying, "You are still wrong, Hardishman, but you are wrong in an interesting way."
I also love that line.
I know. I feel that way so much about people sometimes.
Yeah.
I want to use
You're
that
wrong,
with people.
but it's at least interesting.
Yeah, you're wrong in an interesting way. He is so interesting as a character because he's pretty, like, nonchalant. I mean, there's a few times that he asks, like, are you going to kill me? And he just asks it kind of like that, like, are you going to kill me now? They're like,
Mhm.
well, no. It's like, okay,
Cool.
how about now?
There's a couple of times where they get into these ridiculous situations, and he and Mara share a look that's where he basically is like, can you believe two people like us ended up here?
I know. Can you believe?
There's also a great line where they're talking about fairy tales and like this notion of their plan and how they're all like probably going to die, and maybe this fairy tale is actually going to come true or whatever. And the Dustwife says, fairy tales are very hard on bystanders, particularly old women's. I'd rather not dance myself to death in iron shoes if it's all the same to you.
Yeah. That line about how this is a fool's errand and we'll all probably die is something that they continually say, which is going back to the Blistered Lands, like they're trying to kill a prince.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a big deal.
It is.
Yeah, like that's a darkness, man.
I also like that. So the moth chose this man, Fenris, as what they need. And this is where my note was like, is this where it gets steamy? Is this the man you need?
You need.
But then I was like, I don't see how this can possibly be a romance. Like, I don't see it. But that question is asked. I think Mara asks it. And even the Dustwife is like, for all we know, we just needed him to get through the goblin market. Like, he may have
open
served
a
his
jar.
need. Yeah, like, couldn't tell you what your need is.
Nope.
Yeah.
It could be done now. Like,
Yeah, and they talk about that in the context of they're not sure if Fenris is going to stay with them. But Fenris kind of overhears this conversation, and he's like, no, you guys saved me. I'll be as useful to you as I possibly can be until I die.
yeah.
Which I thought was incredibly noble.
I think if
I
this
know.
book had been another like 200 pages, we probably could have gotten some like steamy romance in it as well.
Yes.
But I'm so satisfied with what we have already that would quite literally just be icing on the cake.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's Madame Kingfisher's vibe also.
Yeah.
Which I'm honestly like,
That's fine. Totally
and
good.
it's just, it's so sweet. Like, we do
It
get,
is.
there is a little bit of romance, but it's very much not the plot. And it's just nice.
It
It
nice.
is. So they begin traveling more and more, and with the glamour on Bone Dog, they're able to basically help people and approach humans and get help in that way. So one of the ways that they earn their keep is Fenris will split wood for people, and those people will in turn feed them, or they let them sleep in their barn, for example. And this is how they make their way back to Mara's kingdom. At some point, it's cold as they keep getting more and more north, and Fenris doesn't have any supplies. They just plucked him out of a goblin market, and so he doesn't have like a blanket. And at some point, Mara's like, you can share my blanket, and literally not an innuendo, but if you're cold, we can snuggle. And they end up sleeping under the same blanket back to back and sharing each other for warmth.
This was such a relatable moment for me that Mara talks about that I have never read in a book, but that I felt like this is it, where she's laying on her side back to back, and she's like, one side of my sinuses starts to get congested, and normally it would turn over, but then my back is like smushed into, my face is smushed into his back. And as someone who frequently changes sides because one side of her sinuses gets messed up, it puts such a damper on cuddling.
Yep.
Like, it is so problematic. And I just love that this was called out in a book as a thing that other people experience.
Beyond that, too, she's like shifting a lot, and she's like, am I? He's probably awake and really annoyed with me right now.
I really regret. I'd rather sleep in the fire.
Just like hyper aware of everything she's doing. So at some point, they make it back into Mara's kingdom, and she remarks that she doesn't feel anything, and she kind of feels bad about it. And Fenris comforts her. He's like, you know, I traveled a lot in my former life, and oftentimes I wouldn't even realize that I was home until like I was 200 miles into the border. So like, you're not alone. When they reach the town, they're basically like, okay, what next? And they're talking about needing to thwart this godmother of the prince because she has a geese of protection on that entire royal family. So they can't touch him unless, or magic can't touch them unless that is somehow broken. And so they need a comparable, I'll say, consultant with the same expertise to kind of help them on this journey. And in order to get this person, they realize that Mara, as a princess, has a godmother, and they're going to go see her.
I love that we're using the word geese now as just a part of like normal speech. I remember when we first
Well, now
read
that I
we
know
were
what it
like,
is.
I know what that is.
Well, and we all thought it was a fake word,
a
but
thing.
apparently it's like,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is the third book that we've had it in.
So they continue on to Trexel to find Mara's godmother. And on the way, they stop in a town. Fenris is going and earning their keep so they can stay at an inn. And the women are just kind of hanging out by a well in the center of town. And they're accosted by a drunk man. And he really, I don't remember what he says, but he's just really making an ass out of himself. And Fenris comes in and tries to make the situation go away, but ultimately ends up fighting this guy and punching him in the face until he falls down. And they quickly have to leave. Yeah, we should go.
Even Fenris is like, we should go now.
When they reach the godmother's cottage, we learn that her name is Agnes and that she always gives the gift of health to the children she blesses. Mara is deeply upset, and she lets all of her frustration and her rage about the situation that she finds herself in with her sister on this godmother. She rails against this woman for always giving health, like, yeah, thanks so much. A lot of good that did me and my sisters. How could you? You should be ashamed of yourself. And she makes Agnes cry, which this scene was so relatable because, like, I get where Mara's coming from, but also Agnes didn't do this.
Right. Like, it wasn't, none of this was her fault.
And at some point, like, Mara realizes this, and she has another great quote where she talks about how, like, how could I, where is it? I'll have to go look for it. But basically, like, how could I assume that she was doing anything other than, like, trying to do the right thing kind of thing?
Exactly.
She's like, doing her very best.
The other thing that I really like is we frequently get frustrated with characters who don't feel what we feel like are normal feelings. And I was so excited to see a character get mad, justifiably so. And even though, like, this wasn't necessarily, like, the godmother's fault, Mara still was in a place where she was allowed to feel her feelings, get them out, and then have her own, like, growth moment of, like, now I've said what I needed to say, but I understand why.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
why it
she
was this
immediately
way.
regrets taking out her anger on this woman. Agnes cries, and we learn two things. One, that health is the only blessing that Agnes, quote unquote, can give. And that Agnes is actually Mara's great aunt. They're related. We find out that Agnes was the bastard of a king who was essentially enchanted by some fairy lady to sleep with him. And a little bit later, she shows up with Agnes, this baby, and the king, and to his queen's credit, both of them take Agnes in. The queen's not mad. She realizes that her husband was enchanted. But that's essentially how Agnes got magic in her blood, because the rest of Mara's family doesn't have that. The queen was never unkind to her, like I said, but did send her to live with an old nurse of theirs who had retired. And then when it became apparent that Agnes had this gift, the queen brought her back to bless the royal children, on. And that's how she became Mara's godmother. In their discussion, they tell Agnes what they're trying to do, and Agnes immediately is like, well, I'll just get my things then, and then we'll continue on. Like, she's in immediately, and I love her for it.
Then let's go.
So they all agree that they're going to be one big merry party, but then Fenris says, the five of us. And this is the one point in the book where I'm like, hold on, I'm not following. Because I guess we're not counting the demon chicken, I guess. Or maybe they're just bad at counting.
We were before.
Yeah. So, but.
Because when he said the four of us, like, the demon chicken was there.
Well, no, because he's counting Bone Dog. So it's the four people, right? So Mara, Dustwife, Agnes, Fenris, and Bone Dog. We're not counting Demon Chicken. Even though Demon Chicken is an integral part of the group.
Yes, and Demon Chicken was counted before.
Yeah, so I don't know. I didn't follow that. It's a really minor thing, but
that is a bummer, because Demon Chicken and Bone Dog are the MVPs of this book in my home.
Yeah, I just don't know why you would count Bone Dog and not Demon Chicken.
Right, like, if you're not going to count one, don't count either. But also, they should both be there because they're both delightful.
Yeah, they're both magical animals, so whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, they intend to set out, but they're a little bit delayed because Agnes is one of those people that packs and repacks and is very indecisive and basically wants to bring way too much on this journey. And Fenris is eventually like, you know what? I'll take your extra. It's fine. And so when they do get on the road. It's, in the afternoon. And so they don't travel that far, which is fine. But as they walk, they talk about blessings and curses. And it comes to light that Agnes can actually bless and curse. She's able to do things like grant someone all sons or curse them or health. And that's about it. She can also do very animal-specific things because that's what she practiced on. Like she can give someone keen whiskers, which she admits isn't particularly useful for humans.
This whole conversation was my favorite thing because you have Dustwife and Agnes, and they're just like bobbing along. And Dustwife is like, that would be a really interesting experiment to give a child whiskers. And she's like, I can't do that. Like, no.
Agnes is like horrified. Could you imagine?
Can you imagine? And there's this question, I think Fenris asks it, like, how do you even become a godmother? Like, did you go through training? And she's like, I wish. I just practiced on, like, cats. And then when there were no more cats, I practiced on mice. And then when there were no more mice, I practiced on whatever.
Yep.
It's so delightful.
They also talk about a plan. Mara tells them the specific blessing that the prince's godmother gives. Oh, this is where I actually write it down. So as a reminder, I shall serve her as I have served all her line, my life bound to theirs. No foreign magic shall harm them. No enemy shall topple their throne. As it has been for all of the children of the royal house, so it shall be for her as long as I draw breath. And there was a lot of specific things in this, but I did not pick up on the thing that ended up being important. I picked up on the as long as I draw breath thing. I was like, so she just hold her breath and you can like kill him or something?
Yeah, I was attuned to that too. Or the whole like magic can't touch you. I was like, well, that's problematic. But which was very clever because it's such a well-written blessing for the purposes of this book where it's not clear the part that matters. And I appreciated that because so many books we read are so like beat me over the head with it.
Exactly. They also talk about the possibility of the Dust Wife raising an army of the dead, but she says that's not a good idea to have this like army of things that only know how to kill, and then once you're done with them, they don't really know what to do, and so that never works out really well.
She's so chill because they ask if she could do it. She's like, I don't know. I know how it would start, but probably wouldn't work for our purposes.
Yeah. And Fenris is like, well, I can just go in there with a sword, and Mara's like, no suicide missions. When they get to the prince's city, they go through the gates and like it's totally fine. Like nobody talks to them or looks at them sideways. And Mara falls down kind of a couple of steps into the city and starts weeping. She like the weight of what they're trying to do has settled on her walking into this huge city filled with so many people. And she's like, there's no way that we're going to be able to do this. But the Dustwife comforts her and says, you wove a cloak with nettle thread and built your own dog out of bones, and now you're concerned with what's impossible?
Just so powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm not understanding. I'm not following. Bring me along.
You've done the impossible so many times. Like, now you're worried?
So they're in the city. They don't know what to do or even where to stay. So Agnes suggests that she could help if they could find her a baby. And she clarifies, doesn't need to be a human baby, just any kind of baby. So they go to...
Because Fenris is like, I draw the line at kidnapping babies.
She's like, we can even give it back to its mother when we're done using them. So they end up going to a market to buy a baby chick. And she picks up this black baby chick and she starts whispering to it, blessing it over and over and over again to make it stick. She starts blessing it with, you will find us a safe space or a safe place so that they can follow the chicken somewhere. And she has to say it over and over again for it to stick. And eventually she feels it stick. And so she puts the chicken on the ground and the chicken starts running off in a direction. And I just think the visual of these 4 humans, 1 demon chicken and a bone dog chasing after a chicken through the city, hilarious.
Thankfully, the bone dog does not look like Bone now.
No, he has his glamour.
But our ragtag bag of murder hobos chases it through the city.
They are murder hobos.
And at some point, the chicken kind of like stops and the blessing has kind of faded or like popped back out of place. And so Agnes resorts to cursing it. And she says, you will find us a safe place or you will die.
Which is so dark. But she doesn't let anybody hear that last part, I don't think.
Not yet.
No. And when we do find out, she's so embarrassed. She's like,
look. And they eventually are led to a house in a neighborhood that is shabby but clean, right? So clearly an economically depressed area, but safe, quiet, off the beaten track. And when they...
this next part really...
I can't.
So it goes from like, we're like happy, everything's fun, to like, it's dark.
It's really dark. And
It's creepy as hell.
They learn that there's a lady in this house that rents rooms, and they knock on the door. She lets them in, and when they get a good look at her, they realize that she has a wooden puppet sitting on her shoulder that is alive, and it has a string tied around her throat that he pulls to choke her when he is displeased. Agnes calls it a cursed child, and when the landlady leaves them alone in their rooms, we learn that a cursed child is a toy that has basically been magically imbued with all the hopes and dreams and fears of a child that basically happens when it comes into contact with an errant bit of dark magic and they come alive. But usually they're dealt with long before adulthood, so it's really unusual to see a full-ass grown woman with one of these cursed childs.
My note here is like, can someone, I don't know, do something about that? Because it's horrifying.
And that's what Mara says. She's like, can we have to do something for this woman.
And she's like, burn it? Great, get the tinder.
Yeah. And so we learned that, like, basically these toys end up becoming almost godlike, and the child that created them is their single worshiper or follower. And they decide as a group that when they leave, they will offer the woman to take care of the cursed child for her if that's what she desires.
But they don't want to do it without her permission because you can't help people who do not want to be helped.
Correct.
Which was also like, what a way to turn that lesson into this mystical story.
So they have 2 rooms. Agnes and the Dust Wife and, of course, the Demon Chicken stay in one, as does the baby chicken, who very soon we learn is named Finder. But that means that Fenris shares a room with Mara. And in their room, alone, Fenris shares with Mara that he learned quite a bit about her when they stayed in the inns in her home city. He knows that she would essentially be the next victim of the prince. And he basically says, I feel like I know a lot about you and you don't know as much about me. And so I want to tell you more about myself. And he shares with...
Thank
right,
you.
Yep.
I applaud that so much.
Finally.
I
Yeah.
really love him. Like, he's...
I know.
What a good guy.
He's such a good guy.
Such a good guy.
I also like their dynamic because they're older, right? So she's 30 and he's described as being kind of in his 40s, right?
Yep.
And most of the books we read, it's like you have this 18 to 25-year-old woman and a 3,000-year-old man.
Yep.
So he shares that the man that he killed was a lord who tortured and murdered his son because his son basically got captured after a fight, and this lord viewed his son as a traitor and a coward. Fenris had delivered the boy to his father and had promised the boy that his father would be happy to see him. Like, no, you're fine. Didn't realize that the boy was afraid for a good reason and blamed himself for the boy's death. Mara muses to herself, has this really great line. Maybe the weakness of being good was that evil didn't occur to you. During the night, Mara kind of wakes up and overhears Agnes and the Dust Wife in the other room because the walls are paper thin. And they're having a conversation where Dust Wife is basically asking Agnes, who was your mother? Because you're not just fine at curses. You're very good at curses. And Agnes says basically like, don't worry about it. I don't want to use that power because I don't want to be a bad person. And puts an end to it. The next morning, Agnes proposes to go see the godmother, thinking that she might share more about the blessing as a professional courtesy, and Mara offers to go with her, as the godmother likely didn't notice her at the christening because she was, you know, kind of in the back, off to the side, etc., etc.
Can I just say that I really appreciated that? Like, this book did such a great job of answering questions before I had them or when I had them when it came to, like, specific continuity things. It didn't leave them untouched.
Right.
Which I appreciated.
I did too.
And they were logical answers. They weren't just like one
Right.
line fixers. Like, it made sense to share the information, but it also made sense as the solution
Right.
to the problem.
It did, yeah. And it seemed like a logical thing to do, right? The godmother of the
Yeah.
prince doesn't have a reason not to share the trade secret of her curse, or sorry, of her blessing with Agnes,
Spoilers.
right?
Godmother.
So it's not
Yeah.
a secret. She says the thing out loud. And so the inner workings are, probably only useful to godmothers, and the prince is already alive and not a baby, so it won't affect.
Or so it's not going to like hurt
Exactly.
anything.
So on their way, Agnes kind of asks Mara in a roundabout way, "So, that Fenris guy, huh?" And Mara is mortified and insists that there is nothing there. And Agnes is like, "All right, I'm just saying, a guy like that doesn't come around very often."
Well, and I saw you looking at him when he was chopping
With
wood.
his shirt off.
And Mara was like, "You looked at him too."
And Agnes is like, "Yeah,
I sure
and
did.
it looked good."
And-
I sure did.
big load of muscle over there. That's all I'm
Yep.
saying.
When they arrive at the prince's godmother's house, she actually lives in a temple, which seems bizarre.
Right?
But she's like almost expecting them and invites them into tea. And while they sit down to have tea, Mara becomes a little bit befuddled and bored with the conversation that she can't really overhear. So she kind of wanders off to look at the tapestries that are hanging on the walls of this temple that the godmother lives in. The tapestries are very ugly. They're not coherent. It's not like they depict a picture. It's kind of like modern art if it was very bad.
And a tapestry.
And there's a lot of erratic stitchings and patterns and materials. And Mara, being particularly adept at stitching, is looking at it like, what the fuck am I looking at? Why would you do this?
Like,
and is
who
very
would
puzzled.
possibly do this?
Right. When they go to leave, the godmother comes up to Mara and is like, "Do you know what this is?" And Mara says, "No." And she says, "Okay, great, I can give it to you." And so she cuts the bottom half of one of the tapestries off and gives it to Mara. And Mara's like, "What the fuck? Why would you do that? These are hideous, but they still took a lot of work to do."
Right. And I certainly don't want one.
Right. As they leave, Agnes is like, "Oh, she was very forthcoming, and a very clever thing is happening there." She tells Mara that the godmother hasn't been blessing the royal family. She's been cursing them. So essentially, the important bit of the blessing/curse is, "I shall serve her as I have served all her line, my life bound to theirs." And what essentially is happening is that Agnes thinks that one of the old kings bound this person, the godmother, to his family, and she doesn't actually want to do it. So she's been sucking the life out of these royal people, which is why they age so quickly and why she is still able to be alive.
Yes. I will also say the reason that Mara became kind of like confused or like a little out of it when she was at the godmother's temple
Oh, yeah.
was because of magic that was being used by the godmother to keep her from really understanding the conversation that they were
Yeah.
having.
She just didn't want to be overheard.
Right. Which I think is interesting because I don't know, I just thought that was an interesting way of handling that.
Well, it's interesting in that most godmothers can't affect like adults, but this godmother is so powerful that she can a little bit, at least temporarily.
Yes. I also loved this twist on the blessing because, like, I never thought the godmother to be the villain, but I did think that she was not going to be helpful or like a sympathetic character. Like, I thought she was going to be more of a barrier getting to kill the prince. And for all of this reveal, like, where she ends up not being a bad guy and she's like, "Listen, I don't like this either. Like, I'm just trying to get the fuck out of this place too." Right. And I just, it was just so clever.
When she gave Mara the tapestry, she said, "Take it. You may find it useful, or you may not." And the comment here that Mara had was like, her eyes were boring into her. Like, "You may find this interesting, or not."
Wink.
I can't tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And Marcel just like, "This is hideous.
This is
Thanks.
terrifying. Thank you. I hate it. So back at the ranch, they concoct a plan to basically speak with the dead king that bound the godmother and have him release the binding. To do this, they need to get into the royal crypt, but they can't immediately find a way in that's unguarded, right? So the main entrance is always guarded. It's very ceremonial, blah, blah. But they hypothesize that since they're constantly having to expand this place and make new rooms, there has to be a back entrance where they can do this work, probably near a quarry, so they can like move the rock that they're excavating. And so if they want to investigate this, they need somebody to work at a quarry. And who is the most able-bodied person? It's Fenris.
It's Fenris.
He gets a job at a quarry to hopefully figure that out.
Quarry.
And in the meantime, everybody else waits.
A quarry.
A quarry.
The age of Aquarius.
The age of Aquarius. Why are we like this every single time?
I can't stop it.
So while they're waiting, news comes that the queen, Kanya, has given birth to a son. Crucially, that's the only information they get. They don't know if she's dead or alive.
I loved this bit. I actually have a quote where they're trying to get information, and the quote that Mara has is, "This is hopeless. After 10 minutes and as many stories, the queen was dead, the queen was alive but dying, the queen had died, and her dying wish was that the prince take religious orders. The queen was alive, but the baby was drinking her blood mixed with breast milk and would not survive. The queen was fine but tired. The baby was alive, the baby was dead. There were 2 babies, there was 1 baby. The queen had given birth to a school of fish."
Yeah. Just like the gossip mill at its finest.
Yes.
Fortunately, Fenris arrives home and announces that he and the Dustwife have figured out how to get into the royal crypt. So just in time, because they math that they have 3 days until the christening. So after the christening is when the godmother blesses or / curses the child, and they need to release the godmother before that happens. Mostly because Mara doesn't want her nephew to be bound by this at all, but also because she's terrified that Kanya is going to be like immediately murdered by her husband now that she's given birth to a son.
Right.
So they talk about the next step. So let's assume that they find the king. Let's assume that they get him to unbind the godmother. How are they going to get into the christening? And they're like, And Mara's like, well, I could probably get in, but that might look a little sketchy if like the godmother's dead or something like that. And Agnes chimes in and she says, I'll definitely be able to. She says, quote, "There's only one story about godmothers that's always true. Bad things happen if you don't invite us to the christening."
I loved that.
I love these bits of Agnes that come out that are just like, oh, you a bad bitch. Okay.
You a bad bitch. And these like, as much as this has like fairy tale vibes, there's some like that where it's like, this is fairy tale. Like this is a thing. Like, hello, Sleeping Beauty. If you don't invite the fairy godmother,
bad things happen.
Bad things
Well,
happen.
she's also got these sweet moments too, because like Mara's freaking out about all of this and like feeling really anxious, and they're like, and Mara says like, "I can fret and I intend to," and Agnes says, "And I won't stop you. A good fret is balm for the soul. Just don't overdo it." And I loved that line because like sometimes you just gotta worry a little bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do. You just got to get it out.
There's also a great line here too where Mara's kind of talking to herself about how unfair this is and whatnot, and she thinks to herself, "Nothing is fair except that we try to make it so. That's the point of humans, maybe, to fix the things the gods haven't managed."
I loved that line too.
So good.
It's so good.
I cannot wait for this book to come in hardcover so I can just read it again and highlight the whole damn thing.
So the night before they enter the catacombs to find this king, Fenris and Mara talk in the dark about what to expect and how terrified both of them are. And Mara eventually asks Fenris to sleep with her so that they can be back to back like they were when they were traveling.
Yeah, crucially,
And-
not sleep with her sexually, but sleep with her in a bed.
Right, sleep with her in a
I
bed as a
know.
comfort thing. And it's very clear that both of them find this comforting, and they're both immediately relieved when this happens because it helps them both fall asleep. And I'm just like, oh my God, it's so sweet.
It is so sweet.
It's such pure
Such
love.
pure love, yes. As they leave the house the next day, they bid the housekeeper adieu, and the Dustwife basically incapacitates the cursed child and offers the woman to like get rid of it. And the woman starts freaking out. She's like furious she even offered and begs the dust wife not to hurt it. And so they keep the cursed child alive and leave the housekeeper to her own devices.
Which is
terrifying.
Why?
Yeah.
So scary.
Yeah.
In the catacombs, it quickly becomes very dark, and so they use the moonlight in the earthen jar to see, and they wander around until they find a ghost, or a room with a ghost still around. So, because most of these are so very old, most ghosts don't stick around for very long unless they have a reason to do so, and boy, does this ghost have a reason to do so. This ghost is the ghost of a queen who is furious that she was replaced. She did not bear children to the king that she was married to, and so her husband took another, and those kids were eventually murdered, and the blame was placed on this woman. As punishment, they buried her alive, and she's real mad about it.
No.
And I can't blame her.
But I do love the dust wife's reaction to this. Calm yourself, or I'll lay you back down and find another spirit to work with. Your rage does not impress me.
Yeah, and this woman keeps saying, "How dare you? Do you know who I am? The Great. The Great." And the dust wife's like, "Yeah, I don't know who you are either, so, like, let's move on."
Like, none of us know who you are. Let's wrap it up. The Great!
This woman eventually tells him that her grandfather was buried with his boat, but they won't ever reach it because they'll get caught by the thief wheel before they find it, and no one knows what that means, even the dust wife. A little bit ominous.
Super ominous.
They leave this woman and they do find the boat and they start heading backwards from there. In one room, it's very obvious that it had been robbed long ago. And while they're kind of poking around in here, they hear a whistle. And then they hear it again. And then it starts getting closer and they realize that it's actually the returned echo of somebody or many voices telling them to run, that it's coming for them. And before long, a huge tar-covered wheel enters the room, but instead of it being covered in tar, it's made up of the mashed together souls of robbers and probably some poor laymen who were just doing their jobs. And those souls are the ones that are telling them to run.
Which, again, we were having a great time, and now it's fucking dark in here.
Yeah. This is the thief wheel.
Yeah, her cadence is like...
I don't love scary things. Don't love them.
I
know you love scary things. But I liked... These things were not necessarily scary to me so much as they were, like, unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the author did a great job of writing things that were unsettling and kind of scary or, like, uncomfortable, but still, like, maintaining, like, a certain level of it's not going to be that scary kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not, like, exclusionary to people who don't... Like, if you don't like scary or don't like horror, you can still enjoy this book.
So the thief wheel's in the room with them, and the dust wife declares that they are not robbers, and so the thief wheel has no power over them. But the thief wheel does not care and runs the dust wife down, extinguishing the moonlight and plunging them all into darkness. Mara...
Thief wheel gives
no fucks. Mara's disoriented, and the wheel comes for her, too, and drags her around, but eventually she's dropped. And when she is dropped, she basically passes out for some amount of time, and when she wakes up, she's alone and in complete darkness, which is horrifying.
Yeah.
She essentially has to feel her way along the walls until she, I guess, tries to hear her friends. So she goes along and realizes at some point that instead of a wall, she's feeling a death mask, and she freaks out, backs up, and then gets immediately lost. She doesn't remember which way she came in, which way she was going, and she puts her back to a wall and starts to cry and despair a little bit. But just as she does, she sees a dim light starting to appear and grow closer. It's described as being a very golden light, much warmer than torchlight. And as it gets closer, she realizes that she's seeing the saint from the goblin market, the woman with the left hand that she holds in her right hand. And she gestures to Mara with the left hand that's being held with her right to be quiet. So she basically puts the left hand finger against her lips, but she's holding it with the right hand. It's very creepy. Yeah.
It's very creepy. Yeah.
And she gestures for Mara to follow her. And so Mara follows her in silence. And as they walk, she realizes that the saint in front of her is actually getting dimmer and growing more transparent and starting to disappear. But as soon as she disappears, she hears the voices of the rest of her murder hobo friends and realizes that the saint has led her back to safety.
So one of the things she also says while she's walking along with the saint is like, a long time later it would occur to Mara to wonder why the saint had been there in the palace of dead kings. At the time it did not. She was a saint and saints walked wherever they would. I too would like to know why that saint was there.
I'm fascinated. I would read a whole book about that
know.
saint.
Yeah.
Me too.
When she reaches her friends, Fenris embraces her and is like, I thought I'd lost you. I'm so glad you're okay. And we realize that they had all been kind of scattered to the winds and they'd lost essentially about a day. Not great when they had 3 to start with.
Yeah.
So they continue on and they eventually find the right tomb that they're looking for. They wake the king up and he is immediately haughty and imperious, tells the dust wife basically to go fuck herself, that she can beg and he might consider releasing the godmother, but won't promise to it, essentially. And rather than calling the godmother a godmother, he calls her a witch skin, which is an interesting term that I've never heard before.
No, but I like it.
Yeah. So the dust wife is basically like, yeah, how about you go fuck yourself? I will make you do this. And so she releases the demon chicken upon him. And what that means is the demon chicken sits on his death mask and starts pecking at a crack in the face of it, which for some reason causes the king pain. Mm-hmm. And so the chicken is attacking the death mask. The ghost of the king has basically imbued the entire chamber with his power. And so there are murals on the wall of like his conquests, and his power makes the soldiers in those murals come alive and start to try to attack the dust wife. Eventually, though, the dust wife does overpower him by bashing the murals in the room with her staff, along with the demon chicken pecking at his death mask. But this again causes the light to go out in the room. And so Fenris is fumbling for a candle in his pack and he's saying, candle, 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 candle. I get the impression he doesn't like the dark very much.
No, definitely not.
And in the aftermath, we learned that it's not that the bond has been broken, but the dust wife has silenced the king or like put him out of commission long enough for the godmother hopefully to slip her bonds. And the demon chicken, tells everybody what she thinks of the king by shitting on the death mask.
Just the best fucking character.
I know. So now that they have this task done, they're like, all right, to the christening. Fuck, where are we?
Now we're just lost in these catacombs.
Yeah. And Mara has been kind of ruminating on something in the back of her mind. She still thinks about the tapestry that she has with her. And she realizes that the tapestry is a map of the catacombs and it will show them the way out. And it leads them right to her temple. So not only, they don't come out the way they came in. They came in through a quarry. This is also not the main entrance that's guarded. This is a different entrance to the catacombs that leads directly to the godmother's house, which is that temple. When they go to the house, they see the godmother, and she is essentially waiting around to see who freed her. And it's Agnes and Mara, and she's like, well, it's obviously not you two. And it's not Fenris. And then the dust wife comes out, and she's like, so it was you. You have power over the dead. And as soon as she does this, she starts to turn into a pile of dust and is no more. So, on to the christening. They go. Mara goes first and alone and is allowed to go in. Kanya and her mother are both surprised to see her, and she tries to basically tell Kanya what has happened, but doesn't get a lot out. She just says she's out of breath, so she says, the godmother, I'm sorry I'm late. But before she can really say more words, everybody's kind of asking where the godmother is because she's late. She hasn't shown up. And instead of the prince's godmother, Agnes shows up. Agnes enters the throne room, and everybody's just like, who the fuck is this bitch?
Who the fuck are you?
And she says that she will stand in as the godmother, and nobody like knows what to do. So they just kind of let her.
There's not like a precedent for this.
And Mara knows what's about to happen, so she's holding her sister back from getting to the baby that's about to be blessed. But as Agnes approaches, she kind of like draws herself up, and her eyes are described as being like emeralds that are on fire, and she's like this very intimidating person, even though like physically she's not. And she curses the baby boy to grow up fatherless and healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And after this, the room erupts into chaos.
Yes.
The prince tells his guards to seize this woman and bring her head to him. Agnes starts running for the door, but then Bone Dog appears and starts attacking the guards. But then other guards rush Bone Dog, and one of them takes a pole arm and puts it into the back of Bone Dog, and he scatters all across the floor.
I do need to make a caveat right now, because if you are upset by this, don't worry, I was too. I'm gonna go ahead and spoil it a little bit. Bone Dog turns out to be okay in the end.
Yeah,
we'll cover
crying.
how and why.
I have a crying emoji in my notes.
Right.
I was gonna be really upset. Like I love horror. I love creepy things. If a dog gets hurt in a book, I am done with that goddamn book.
Nope, can't do it.
And I felt the same way in this book. If Demon Chicken died, I was gonna be like, no, I'm out.
That's why
Yeah,
I
I'm
have
out.
to make a caveat that like Bone Dog will be okay, and we'll cover how you don't have to like yeet this book out or yeet this podcast out your window.
Right. Yeah, it's a good
Bone
call.
Dog will be fine.
But Bone Dog is basically turning into a bunch of bones and like not making sense for how a dog should die. Gives Fenris the opening that he needs to kill the prince. And he basically just walks up to the prince. He puts a hand on his shoulder and a sword through his back. And
He's like, hey man.
he's immediately rushed by guards, obviously, and surely will be killed, except Kanya takes the power of the room and demands everybody to hold. Stop what you're doing. Let's just take a minute. She demands
Take a
that
breath.
Fenris be taken alive so that she can know everything that's in his brain and know who attacked them. She gives Mara an out, saying, I understand. You were trying to warn us now. And Mara says, totally. Yeah, that's what I was doing.
100%.
Kanya declares that she will act as regent for her son, who is now lawfully the king. And she pulls two other men who we come to understand are basically her, the two most powerful rivals within the Northern Kingdom. And she calls on them to act as regents with her. And in one fell swoop, seals her power and takes control of the situation. Gives Mara and Fenris an out.
So, I have a question for you guys. Obviously, the child was cursed to live fatherless. In my mind, I thought that meant that, like, the father, like, the prince would basically just fall apart.
Cease
Right,
to
like, he would just
exist.
wither into nothingness at a certain point. But I guess and so when it wasn't happening, and when, like, Fenris was, like, stabbing him, I was like, wait, why do we even have to do this? Shouldn't he just die? But then I realized that, like, much in the same way of, like, you know, we needed him, but we didn't know what we needed him to do.
Mm-hmm.
Magic doesn't exactly work necessarily always that way. Like, yeah, sure, the godmother withered away to nothing, but that doesn't mean that the prince would have based off of that curse.
Right.
And I thought, because I had a similar thing, but a similar thought that he would just like, pff, and like not exist anymore. But I think it was a good way of tying in these lessons that we get in like any good fairy tale. But like with the cursed child, the cursed puppet, like you can't help someone who can't help themselves. So like you're saying like magic can only go so far. Like I can give you all of the things, but you still have to deal the blow.
Right.
I can make it easier, but like you have to do it. And I really like that idea of magic.
Yeah, I do wonder, though, it kind of dooms Kanya to be alone, though, also.
Oh, yeah, because is it like biological fatherless or can she just never have love?
So Mara debriefs with her mother and sister, and they speak about how, you know, Kanya effectively secured power and how relieved all of them are that the prince is dead, but they don't really know how to save Fenris until Mara remembers the woman who was buried alive. So Kanya buries Fenris with her husband as punishment, and the people love her for it.
Mm-hmm.
They find it brutal and effective and appropriate. And the plan, obviously, is that the Dustwife and Mara are going to break him out. But it's very brutal. She also dispatches emissaries to Hardak to understand why the fuck they attacked them, blah, blah. And Mara and the Dustwife do rescue Fenris. And he's just only a little bit scarred. He's just a little bit tortured and a little bit scarred. And he's very grateful to see them both.
This poor man. He's like, so how many days has it been? And the Dustwife is like, maybe half a day. He's like, what? Just half a day?
Yeah.
She's like, yeah.
Well, I think she said it was 14 hours. So it was a day and a half. But he was like, it feels like it was a lot longer than that.
A day is 24 hours.
Yeah,
oh my God.
it's like
You're
half
right.
a day.
Yeah.
You got there.
You're
It's
so
okay.
pretty. It's okay. It's okay.
Beautiful tropical fish.
They're there. So our merry band of murder hobos. So Agnes was able to escape the throne room and disappear, essentially.
You keep calling them murder hobos. They actually only murder one guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they are hobos. Does that not make them murder hobos?
Murder hobos.
You only have to murder one person to be a murderer.
Our merry
Do you want
band
them
of
to be
ragtag friends.
Band.
Is that better?
I just like the term murder
yeah.
hobo. I just think it's
Yo,
fine.
I get it. Clarification, they only killed the one guy. And he deserved it.
But that makes you a murderer.
Like,
Once a
There's
murderer,
not
always
like
a murderer.
limit.
And to be clear,
Right.
Fenris killed 2 people.
That's fair.
So
And also, we don't know how many people Dustwife has killed because, like, she's kind of shady.
yeah,
not
she's
wrong.
a little sketch.
Right.
Anyway, they leave the city in a wagon, kind of smuggling Fenris, and to a certain extent, Mara out. Mara had essentially said goodbye to her sister before she left, knowing that it would be for good. Someone would eventually remember what really happened at the christening, and beyond that, her sister warns her that the queen's only going to be, happy for you to be a quote-unquote nun for so long. Eventually, she's going to try to ship you off and marry you for some political purpose, and that makes Mara's skin crawl. So she leaves that life completely behind. Her sister Kanya gave her some money and a bag of bones, saying that the guards made sure to get every single last one because they were too afraid that they would be cursed if they left one behind. And this is, of course,
Damn straight.
Bone Dog. Outside the city, Agnes and the Dustwife decide to split off. Agnes is going to go back to the Dustwife's place with her because eventually somebody's going to put 2 and 2 together and start looking for Agnes because she's very clearly the godmother of Mara's family. But before they do that, they have to go back to Agnes's house and get some of her things and her chickens and things like that.
She just, like, decides she's going to go live with the Dustwife.
Yeah.
And Dustwife is like,
What?
you and me? She's like, yes, but I need to bring my chickens. She's like, okay, what?
Okay.
And they just, like, ride off into the sunset together.
with Demon Chicken. And
With
Finder.
Demon Chicken.
With Demon
Yeah,
Chicken.
she's still there.
And Finder.
So this leaves Fenris and Mara to their own devices. And Mara basically asks what's next. And, Fenris can't go home because he's a wanted man. Mara doesn't want to go back to her place. And so they basically decide to stay together and perhaps go back to the Goblin Market and free some of the other humans that were trapped there. Who knows? But before they set off to do that, Mara toils a whole day and a whole night putting Bone Dog back together. And when she's done, he doesn't immediately wake up. And so she starts begging him to wake up and weeping. And one of her tears lands on the flat of his white, big blockhead skull. And that wakes him up. And she is just so grateful. She says she's lost her family, the abbess, and so many people that she can't lose him too. And he comes back to her.
Legitimately started to tear up when she was begging Bone Dog to wake up and he wasn't waking up.
I know.
I was like,
Fuck.
about to cry. Like, I was near tears.
I firmly believed at that point that the author would not have given us that piece, like not given the bones back if Bone Dog wasn't going to come back. So I was like, no,
Yeah.
he's coming back. He's coming back.
Yeah.
I just, like, no, and I needed to believe that too, but I was just like, God damn it, this is so emotional.
Emotional damage.
Damage. I was about to be so upset.
Yep. And our parting scene is between Mara and Fenris, and they start leaning close together, giving into the feelings with each other, and would have kissed, except that Bone Dog decided they were wrestling and joined the fray.
Which was also such a cute ending. Like, okay, we're here for steam. We are the spice traders, but it's just such a pure little love story.
Yeah. Like, for all of the books that we have read and will read that's just like smut and no feelings and no plot, like, I was here for the feelings here.
Yeah.
I was so here for the feelings.
Yeah. My last note is what a wonderful, whimsical story this is.
Yes. So good.
Yes.
That's great. So let's get into our ratings. We are unanimous in our ratings.
We are hardcore unanimous.
So I will read off our spice level. It's fairly obvious. There was no spice in this book, so we gave it an NA. Liz, will you tell us how we rated the writing style?
all three of us rated the writing style at a 5 out of 5, which I think might be our like second 5-star book. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. But 5 out of 5. This writing was just so gorgeous and magical. And like I mentioned before, and we all did, that even these like magical phrases that were being used were still so human. Like it wasn't whimsy for the sake of just being whimsical. It was just human and magical at the same time. And I just, holy shit, this book, guys.
Yeah.
So pretty.
Yeah.
So jumping off of that, Des, how do we rate the quality of the storytelling?
We gave it a 5 out of 5. The story was just so good from beginning to end. Like, there were parts that like we still have questions about, but like they're not egregious questions. They're like more of like a I don't even know how to describe it, but like everything that I wanted answered was answered, and things that weren't answered like were fun little like thought puzzles to work on for my own brain. And like the world that was built was so powerful and moving, and such a beautiful, beautiful book.
100,000,000,000% agree. So if it hasn't been abundantly clear, we all recommend this book, even though it doesn't have any spice, so it's not really what we're typically reviewing. This book, we had said at some point that I feel a responsibility to tell people about this book. It is just such a beautiful piece of literature. And so if you have time or room on your to be read shelf, please add this book.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. We did it. Those are our thoughts on Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. Thank you, as always, for joining us on this journey. What did you think? Let us know on the socials. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Goodreads, and Patreon at Spice Traders Pod. Until next time, we will see you later.
Bye.
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 Bye.